Chapter 12. Supply Chain Preventive Controls for Human Food. The safety of your product depends on much more than just what you control within your own facility. Use of an ingredient that has a history of association with a specific hazard may require a supply chain program as a preventive control. In this course, the terms Supply Chain Preventive Control and Supply Chain Program refer to requirements in Subpart G, Supply Chain Program in the Preventive Controls for Human Food Regulation. Companies may have extensive supplier programs that encompass much more than food safety elements to manage their supplier expectations and performance. This chapter focuses on the requirements of the regulation for verifying measures for control of hazards prior to receipt and not a company's other supplier efforts. Understanding the potential hazards associated with your supply chain helps to determine preventive controls needed to control those hazards either within your facility or at the supplier. Some potential hazards have minimal food safety significance and can be addressed by GMP programs. Chapters 4 and 5 on food safety hazards identify some ingredients that have a history of association with specific foodborne hazards. This chapter reviews definitions of supplier, receiving facility, and customer as they apply to the preventive controls for human food regulation. Required contents for a regulatory compliant supply chain program are discussed, as well as appropriate activities to verify control at the supplier level. Record requirements are also discussed. Special requirements for Foreign Supplier Verification Programs, FSVP, for importers of food for humans and animals are not covered in this chapter. However, if you import food products or ingredients, you also need to comply with some additional requirements. Regardless of whether your ingredients come from a U.S. or a foreign supplier, the principles with respect to food safety are the same. The hazard analysis process, see Chapter 8, Hazard Analysis, determines when a hazard requiring a supply chain applied control exists. Some ingredients may not have hazards requiring a preventive control. For example, an ingredient like vinegar has not been associated with significant food safety issues. A vinegar processor must operate under GMPs, conduct their own hazard analysis, and implement controls as necessary. But typically a receiver of vinegar may safely conclude that a food safety hazard requiring a supply chain applied control is not likely to be a concern. Other ingredients, however, do have an association with specific food safety hazards. You do not need a supply chain program if you implement a preventive control for the hazard within your facility. However, if you are a manufacturer/processor and the hazard is controlled before you receive the ingredient, a supply chain program is required. To illustrate this point, let us look at different options that could have been used by the EG Food Company to address the hazard of salmonella in eggs. The hazard analysis for the EG Food Company identified salmonella as a hazard requiring a preventive control in the liquid pasteurized eggs that they receive. They chose to use a process preventive control to prevent the hazard from causing illness by the consuming public. However, they could have used other preventive controls approaches. EG Food Company could have used a supply chain program instead of process control. This would require that they verify that the controls at the supplier, for pasteurization of the egg and for preventing recontamination, are adequate to control the hazard on an ongoing basis. Alternatively, the EG Food Company could have avoided applying a preventive control by informing their customers that the omelets are not processed to control salmonella and by obtaining written assurance from all of their customers that they heat all omelets served to a validated temperature that would kill salmonella. In any of the three approaches, the hazard, salmonella, can be effectively inactivated to prevent illness. The EG Food Company can choose to apply any one of these approaches to ensure the hazard from salmonella is controlled. The EG Food Company decided to use process control for the hazard of salmonella in pasteurized liquid egg, perhaps because they thought it was more efficient to monitor their own process. Additionally, cooking the omelet will also address potential recontamination of the omelet batter during mixing. They handled pasteurized milk in a similar manner, using a process preventive control. Conversely, e.g. food company identified a supply chain control for the biological hazards in pasteurized processed cheese. In this example, the hazard analysis concluded that pasteurized processed cheese has vegetative and spore-forming pathogen hazards requiring a supply chain applied control. The e.g. food company did not have processes in place to control these hazards because the cheese was just placed on the cooked omelet without any additional heat. They approve the supplier and use a third-party audit to verify that controls are adequate. Other verification options are discussed later in this chapter. The examples on this and the previous slide illustrate the flexibility that a company can use to ensure that hazards requiring a preventive control are controlled. Sometimes there are options, such as in the pasteurized egg example for the omelets. However, sometimes supply chain control is the only option, such as in the pasteurized processed cheese example. While the third-party audit is not conducted at receiving, the shipping clerk checks to assure that the material came from the approved supplier. Because the audit is not conducted at receiving, then others may choose to check no. To understand supply chain program requirements, it is important to understand the definition of supplier, receiving facility, and customer in the context of the regulation. You, the manufacturer/processor, are the receiving facility for the raw material or other ingredient. Your supplier may be a manufacturer or processor of the food that you receive. Note that if you receive raw agricultural ingredients, your supplier is the entity that grows the food or raises the animal. For example, if Farmer Green grows a crop that is harvested and labeled by a regional harvesting organization, your supplier is still Farmer Green. Your customer can be another manufacturer/processor or an entity that prepares the food, such as a food service or retail establishment, or other. The customer may or may not be subject to the preventive controls for human food regulation. As the receiver, you must document and implement a supply chain program when hazards requiring a supply chain applied control are identified through hazard analysis. It's important to review some definitions for this chapter. Supplier, the establishment that manufactures/processes the food, raises the animal, or grows the food that is provided to a receiving facility without further manufacturing/processing by another establishment, except for further manufacturing/processing that consists solely of the addition of labeling or similar activity of a de minimis nature. 21 CFR 117.3. Receiving facility, a facility that is subject to Subpart C, preventive controls, and G, supply chain program, of this part and that manufactures/processes a raw material or other ingredient that it receives from a supplier. 21 CFR 117.3. Customer, the entity the receiving facility sells to, may or may not be subject to the requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls and may manufacture, process, or prepare the food in accordance with applicable food safety requirements. Based on 21 CFR 117.136. Supply chain applied control, a preventive control for a hazard in a raw material or other ingredient when the hazard in the raw material or other ingredient is controlled before its receipt. 21 CFR 117.3. A supply chain program is not required in the following situations. 1. The hazard analysis concludes that there are no hazards requiring a supply chain applied control. 2. You control the hazards requiring a preventive control within your facility, or 3. You rely on your customer to control the hazard. You identify for your customer that the food has not been processed to control the hazard, and you have annual written assurance from your customer that they are following procedures to do so. For example, Company A's hazard analysis determines salmonella is a hazard in raw nuts that they receive raw from a farmer, the supplier. Company A sorts and shells the nuts for their customer, who then roasts the nuts using a validated process. Company A is not required to apply a preventive control for salmonella if 1. They disclose in documents accompanying the shipment that the nuts were not processed to control salmonella, and 2. They obtain written assurance from their customer, on an annual basis, that salmonella is being controlled along with information on how it is being controlled. Documentation requirements vary depending on whether or not the customer is subject to the preventive controls for human food regulation. Consult 21 CFR 117.136 for specific requirements if this situation applies to you. Two additional situations where the supply chain program requirements do not apply are: 1. When the receiving facility is an importer in compliance with the Foreign Supplier Verification Requirements, FSVP, and 2. When the food is supplied for research or evaluation use. A receiving facility that is an importer in compliance with FSVP requirements already has documentation that provides assurance that the hazards requiring a supply chain applied control have been significantly minimized or prevented. Food that is supplied for research or evaluation use is not subject to supply chain program requirements provided that the food is not intended for retail sale and is not sold or distributed to the public. The food is labeled food for research or evaluation use. The food is supplied in a small quantity consistent with a research, analysis, or quality assurance purpose. It is used only for that purpose and unused food is properly disposed of, and the food is accompanied with documents stating that it will be used for research or evaluation and cannot be sold or distributed to the public. General requirements for your supply chain program when a supply chain applied control is identified are listed above. You must approve suppliers for these ingredients for which a supplier has applied the control for a hazard. You must determine the supplier verification activities that you will use to verify that the supplier is applying appropriate controls, and then you must ensure that these activities are conducted and documented. These activities will vary, depending on the food, the hazard, and your food safety system. Each of these requirements is discussed below. In some situations, the supply chain applied control may be conducted by an entity other than your supplier. For example, aflatoxin is a hazard associated with field corn. A milling company may have an aflatoxin control program for the dried corn they receive. A baking mix company may conduct verification activities at the miller to ensure that aflatoxin is controlled. If you receive cornbread muffin mix, you may verify the documentation from the baking mix company on their program for the miller. You must approve suppliers of ingredients requiring a supply chain applied control before you receive the material. When necessary and appropriate, unapproved suppliers whose material is subjected to adequate verification activities before use, see verification discussion below, may be used on a temporary basis. Your supplier approval program must have written procedures for receiving the ingredients requiring supply chain applied controls. Additionally, records that document that material is indeed received from approved suppliers are required. You may use your existing receiving record system or add to it to record this information. Once approved suppliers are identified, you must identify and implement appropriate verification activities to ensure that the supplier actually controls the hazard requiring a supply chain applied control. Verification is usually not conducted at the same frequency as monitoring activities. See Chapter 13, Verification and Validation Procedures. Typically, verification is conducted after the fact as a check that the system is operating according to the plan. While some verification activities are performed for each lot, e.g., records review for in-house preventive controls, some supplier verification activities could be performed at a reduced frequency, depending on many factors, including the nature of the hazard and supplier performance. Appropriate supplier verification activities are listed on the slide above. One or more of the following verification activities must be conducted before initial use and periodically thereafter for ingredients that require a supply chain applied control. An annual on-site audit of food safety practices conducted by a qualified auditor. This is required for hazards that can cause serious adverse health consequences or death unless you develop written justification for why less frequent auditing or another verification activity provides adequate assurance that the hazard is being controlled. Sampling and testing of the supplier's product for the hazard of concern. This may be done by the supplier or the receiving facility. A review of the supplier's relevant food safety records, such as processing times and temperatures. Other procedures based on the risk associated with the ingredient and the supplier. The extent to which any of these activities is used must be risk-based and consistent with regulatory requirements. Let's take a look at an important definition. Verification: those activities, other than monitoring, that establish the validity of the food safety plan and that the system is operating according to the plan. 21 CFR 117.3 Definitions. The verification activities used depend on the specific situation. The preventive controls for human food regulation requires consideration of the above in determining relevant verification activities. For example, when considering the hazard, is it likely to be present at high concentrations that would easily be detected by testing, or is the concentration expected to be so low that testing is unlikely to be reliable in detecting the hazard? This concept is discussed further in Chapter 13, Verification and Validation Procedures. Where a preventive control is applied, e.g., at the supplier or at the supplier's supplier, may also impact verification procedures. For example, aflatoxin may be a hazard requiring a preventive control in cornmeal. The most effective controls for aflatoxin are applied during production, harvest, and storage of the corn prior to milling. Thus, upstream verification procedures for aflatoxin preventive controls may be applied by a miller who would also apply preventive controls in their operation based on risk. However, farther down the supply chain, e.g., companies using cornmeal, a certificate of analysis, COA, from the cornmeal supplier or periodic testing for aflatoxin may be relevant. Knowledge of your supplier's procedures, processes, and practices related to food safety may also influence verification procedures. For example, a supplier that produces only peanuts would not be a major concern for non-peanut allergens because they only handle peanuts. However, a supplier that makes a variety of nut products with different kinds of nuts may present a higher risk because tree nuts of different varieties have different allergens present. Understanding how such a company controls allergens may be important to your supply chain program. Another consideration is a supplier's compliance history with FDA regulations. Warning letters and import alerts for a supplier may warrant taking extra precautions to verify that adequate controls are in place. Country of origin may be a consideration as well. An ongoing relationship with a supplier is another important consideration. Some companies have many years of positive experience with a specific supplier, which may reduce the extent of verification activity needed. Conversely, constantly switching suppliers for an ingredient requiring a supply chain applied control may warrant heightened verification activity to build confidence in the supplier's ability to meet your food safety requirements. There may be other factors to consider, such as transportation and storage methods used by the supplier, e.g., when a food requires refrigeration for safety. For very small businesses, farms, and shell egg producers, as defined by FDA, supplier verification activities are limited. The receiving facility must obtain written assurance that the supplier retains its regulatory status before approving the supplier and annually by December 31st, and at least every 2 years thereafter obtain written assurance the qualified facility complies with applicable food safety regulations or that farms acknowledge that the food is subject to the adulteration provisions of the FD&C Act. If this applies to you, see 21 CFR 117.430 for specific requirements. For these suppliers, a receiving facility may use the absence of warning letters or other FDA compliance actions in determining whether to approve the supplier. Only the receiving facility can approve suppliers. However, other entities can determine and conduct other activities. The receiving facility must review and assess supplier verification activities that are determined by and/or conducted by another entity, and document the review and assessment activity. A supplier may provide test results for the lots that they send to you, the receiving facility, for your review and assessment as a supplier verification activity. However, you cannot rely on a supplier's determination of appropriate verification activities for its own product. you need to determine appropriate verification activities that are consistent with the food that you are producing. Thus, test results from a supplier are only acceptable if you have determined this is an appropriate verification activity for that food. Similarly, a supplier's self-audit or a supplier's review of their own records are not appropriate supplier verification activities. However, a supplier can provide an audit conducted by a qualified third-party auditor if you have determined this is an appropriate verification activity for that food. As noted above, another entity, such as a broker, may perform supplier verification activities for review and assessment by the receiving facility. Remember, the supplier is the entity that manufactures the product, grows the food, or raises the animal. Thus, a broker is not a supplier in regulatory terms. An entity other than the receiving facility may establish written procedures for receiving raw materials and ingredients from suppliers, document that the receiving procedures are followed, and determine, conduct and document appropriate supplier verification activities for those materials. The receiving facility may then review and assess the other entity's documentation to verify that the supply chain applied control was appropriate for their food safety system. Unless you have documentation justifying that other verification activities provide adequate assurance that hazards are controlled, an on-site audit is required when there is a reasonable probability that exposure to a serious hazard requiring a supply chain applied control will result in serious adverse health consequences or death. The audit is required before using the ingredient and at least annually thereafter. You may be able to provide documentation that suggests why less frequent auditing is adequate to assure that controls are in place. For example, you may be able to demonstrate that an audit every 2 years combined with periodic testing provides adequate assurance that the supplier is controlling the hazard. Let's take a look at an important definition. Qualified auditor, a person who is a qualified individual as defined by this part and has technical expertise obtained through education, training, or experience, or a combination thereof, necessary to perform the auditing function required by 117.180 C.2. Examples of qualified auditors include 1. A government employee, including a foreign government employee, and 2. An audit agent of a certification body that is accredited in accordance with regulations of Title 21 Part 1, Subpart M. The audit must be conducted by a qualified auditor who has technical expertise to understand the hazard identified in your hazard analysis, the effectiveness of controls for that hazard, and the requirements of the preventive controls for human foods regulation. It is important to ensure that audits include both records review and observation of practices for a complete picture. Comprehensive systems audits that include records reviews are more likely to reflect conditions throughout the year than an inspection focused only on the state of the facility at the time of the inspection. The audit must address process, allergen, sanitation, and supply chain applied controls, as well as GMPs, as applicable, or, in some cases, compliance to regulations such as the produce safety regulations. The audit must also address the specific hazards identified in your hazard analysis. Some companies use their own qualified employees to audit suppliers, a second-party audit. Such audits allow first-hand review of the critical food safety programs and preventive controls in place at the site. One can obtain a sense for how effective programs are by diligently reviewing program records, observing activities, and interviewing line workers. While this type of audit allows a company to verify that their specific requirements are being met, it requires internal resources and expertise that may not be feasible for some companies. Audits conducted by an independent third party may also be used. Your supplier may be able to provide a third-party audit for your review. Some suppliers are routinely inspected by FDA or other recognized government agencies. Thus, you may be able to rely on the results of these inspections instead of a private party audit and obtain information on these inspections annually from the supplier. Keep in mind that these inspections may not occur annually. Testing of in-process materials, environmental samples, or the food produced by the supplier, either at the supplier's facility, at an outside laboratory, or in your facility may be appropriate if such testing provides meaningful results related to control of a hazard requiring a preventive control. This test information would be captured in a Certification of Analysis (COA). It is important to use methods that are fit for purpose and understand the limitations of testing due to sampling probability. Your approach should depend on the potential hazards and the controls in place for the specific product. Testing for new supplier approval is usually more extensive than for maintenance of approved supplier status. It is advisable to consult a reference book, e.g., ICMSF 2011, a technical expert or other credible source, see Chapter 7, Resources for Preparing Food Safety Plans, to determine appropriate testing and sampling plans for different types of food products. Sometimes indicator tests provide more useful information to verify process control than pathogen testing. For example, coliform testing is used by the dairy industry to verify the effectiveness of the overall pasteurization system, including sanitation, rather than testing for pathogens. Other activities that may be useful for supplier approval and verification depend on the hazards you are managing. Many companies require their vendors to provide a continuing product guarantee certifying that the product meets company requirements, including legal, regulatory, and conformance to specifications. These certificates generally cover multiple shipments or time frames and should be reviewed and renewed at least annually or when requirements change. These generally do not serve as verification activities in the way that audits or testing, e.g., COAs, do, but may be suitable for certain ingredients, such as those with frequent government inspection. Further, they would not be the sole verification activity for compliance with the regulatory requirements. Copies of production records could also be reviewed to verify that the hazards were controlled and that material was produced to your specification. When an audit, other verification activity, relevant complaint, or other information identifies a gap in supplier performance related to a hazard requiring a preventive control, you must ensure that the food you have manufactured is not adulterated or misbranded with respect to allergens as a result of the supplier not adequately controlling the hazard. Corrective actions will vary depending on the issue, as previously discussed in the other chapters on other preventive controls. Because system failures can occur in the supplier's process or procedures from time to time, the supplier must have a corrective action process for making modifications to prevent reoccurrence of an issue. You must ensure that the intended corrective action is actually implemented. In addition, you must evaluate all affected product for food safety to ensure that adulterated food did not enter into commerce. If adulterated product did enter commerce, then a recall would be required. See Chapter 15, Recall Plan. Corrective action is discussed in other chapters, including documentation requirements in Chapter 14, Record-Keeping Procedures. It is good business practice to evaluate your supply chain program on a routine basis, typically annually. Comparing findings from your supplier approval, verification, and corrective action processes against the safety requirements in the supplier specifications and contract may indicate the need for change. Raw material and other ingredient specifications should clearly communicate food safety requirements to the supplier, as well as identify these hazards for your own understanding and use in your supply chain program. If a food safety issue occurs with your product, review your supplier program, including verification activities, to ensure that program inadequacy was not the cause. For example, you may not have identified a hazard that is associated with an ingredient that needed to be controlled by the supplier. Also verify that the supplier took steps to prevent recurrence of issues, when applicable. You or your supplier may create new formulations or new processes. Any ingredient change should be reviewed to ensure that food safety requirements are still met by the supplier if the ingredient is associated with a hazard requiring a preventive control. Similarly, new hazards are periodically identified. Ensure that your supply chain program is adequate to address new hazards associated with the raw material or other ingredient that the supplier provides. Change is a necessary part of the business process. Having procedures in place to accommodate changes can help avoid food safety or potentially disruptive supply chain issues. Two aspects of change should be considered relative to suppliers: changes made by the supplier and changes made by the receiving facility. If suppliers make a change to the ingredients that they provide, the food safety team should be informed to allow reanalysis to determine if changes are needed to the food safety plan or supply chain program. Frequently, supplier communications are handled by purchasing, thus the purchasing team must forward relevant information to the food safety team. The supplier must understand the importance of reporting all changes to customers so they can analyze the change with respect to their use of the ingredient. Conversely, you or your purchasing team may identify a new supplier that can provide a similar ingredient. It is essential that purchasing not make a switch in suppliers of an ingredient or raw material associated with a hazard requiring a supply chain control without the authorization of the food safety team. The new supplier must be approved if the ingredient is associated with a hazard requiring a supply chain applied control. Again, it is important to consider the resources needed to review supplier programs for new suppliers from a food safety perspective before switching suppliers. Reanalysis of the food safety plan may also be relevant for company-initiated supplier changes, especially those for ingredients with hazards requiring a preventive control. Regulators, auditors, and customers view records as the historical method for confirming a program is in place and functional. Without records, one cannot demonstrate supplier programs are implemented as designed and are effective in controlling hazards. This discussion is about records for your preventive controls supply chain program. A document on your supply chain program is the starting point to describe how the facility develops and implements its supply chain program. If the facility is an importer, then documentation that the facility is in compliance with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program requirements under 21 CFR 1 Subpart L is required. You must maintain documentation of the approval of your suppliers that provide ingredients requiring a supply chain applied control. The receiving facility must also have written procedures for receiving raw materials and ingredients and maintain records that demonstrate that all raw materials and other ingredients with hazards requiring a supply chain applied control are received from approved suppliers. You must document the determination of the appropriate supplier verification activities you will conduct for raw materials and other ingredients requiring a supply chain applied control. On-site audits, sampling and testing, review of suppliers' relevant food safety records or other approaches may be identified. Records of the on-site audits for approved suppliers are required. The report must include the supplier name, audit procedures, the dates the audit was conducted, the conclusions, and corrective actions taken in response to significant deviations identified. Documentation that demonstrates that the audit was conducted by a qualified auditor is also required, which could be a receiving facility's employee if the employee meets the qualified auditor definition discussed previously. Records of sampling and testing must identify the material tested, including the lot number as appropriate and number of samples tested. The tests conducted and analytical procedure used, the date the tests were conducted, and the results must be documented, usually on the laboratory test form, which would also specify the laboratory conducting the tests. Corrective actions, if any, must also be documented in response to the detection of hazards. When the receiving facility or audit team reviews a supplier's food safety records, the receiving facility must document the name of the facility, date of the review, conclusions of the review, corrective actions, if any, in response to deficiencies identified during review. If verification activities other than those above are used, they must also be documented. The slide above lists other documents required if applicable to your facility. Supplier nonconformance documents would apply to all facilities. Refer to Chapter 14, Record-Keeping Procedures for Record Retention Requirements. In summary, a supplier program is an essential element of a food safety system. Your supplier is the entity that makes or grows the food or raises the animal you, the receiving facility, use to make your product. The hazard analysis process identifies hazards requiring a supply chain applied control for which a supply chain program must be implemented. The supply chain program must include using approved suppliers and determining, conducting, and documenting supply chain verification activities. Verification activities may include on-site audits, required for serious hazards unless another approach is justified, sampling and testing, review of a supplier's relevant food safety records, and other activities based on risk. Records that document all of these activities must be maintained to demonstrate that your supplier program is operational and effective. Great job! 4 chapters to go. Make sure you check out all the chapter resources and please complete all activities and exercises.